The town of Westbrook, nestled in a peaceful valley, was known for its charming, idyllic atmosphere. With tree-lined streets, immaculate lawns, and white picket fences, it was the epitome of suburban perfection. Neighbors knew each other by name, children played safely in the parks, and the local elementary school served as the heart of the community. For years, life here was quiet and predictable, untouched by scandal or tragedy. At the center of this seemingly perfect world was the Sanders family. John Sanders, a 42-year-old businessman, was admired by many. Tall, charismatic, and successful, he had made a name for himself in the real estate business. His firm had helped shape much of Westbrook's housing market, and his clients trusted him for his sharp negotiation skills. Whether at a board meeting or a local charity event, John commanded attention, his charm drawing people toward him like moths to a flame. John's wife, Catherine, was 39 years old and had once been a successful event planner. But after their children were born, she left her career to dedicate herself to their family. Catherine was the backbone of their household, managing everything from school events to social gatherings. Her life revolved around their two kids, Sarah and Luke, aged 10 and 7, who adored her. From the outside, Catherine seemed to have it all: a loving husband, well-behaved children, and a beautiful home. But beneath the surface, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Catherine's days were long, filled with endless routines, packing lunches, organizing playdates, attending school meetings. And yet, as the years passed, she felt increasingly isolated. John's career demanded more of his time, and his absences became more frequent. There were late nights at the office, business trips that lasted longer than expected, and even weekends spent networking with clients. While Catherine was grateful for John's financial success, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping away: their connection. At night, Catherine would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering when their marriage had started to drift apart. There had been a time when they couldn't wait to see each other, when conversations lasted for hours and laughter echoed through their home. But now, their interactions were brief, often interrupted by the constant buzzing of John's phone or the stress of his work. The love that had once been the foundation of their relationship now felt like a distant memory. John, too, was feeling the strain. The pressures of his business weighed heavily on him. Real estate was a competitive field, and keeping his firm at the top required relentless effort. Every deal, every client, came with its own set of challenges, and the stress was taking its toll. He was exhausted, both mentally and physically, and when he came home, he found it hard to switch off. The children's laughter, once a source of joy, now seemed like background noise to the constant hum of work that never seemed to end. Catherine noticed the change in him. He seemed distracted, distant. When she asked him about his day, his responses were vague, often mumbled between glances at his phone. Family dinners, once a sacred time, became silent affairs, with John's mind clearly elsewhere. Even the children began to pick up on the tension. Sarah, their 10-year-old daughter, would ask, "Why is Daddy always working?" while 7-year-old Luke simply missed the playtime they used to share. Catherine tried to push away her growing doubts, reassuring herself that it was just a phase, that all marriages went through difficult times. But the truth gnawed at her. She had sacrificed so much for their family. Her career, her ambitions, her own personal desires, all had been set aside to support John's rise to success and to raise their children. And now, it felt like she was invisible, like her efforts no longer mattered. Despite her growing unease, Catherine didn't confront John. She didn't want to believe that their marriage was unraveling, that the life they had built together was crumbling before her eyes. Instead, she buried her feelings, focusing on the children and her community responsibilities. She volunteered at the school, organized neighborhood events, and continued to play the role of the perfect wife and mother, all while a storm brewed beneath the surface. Westbrook's outward perfection masked the cracks in the Sanders marriage. The neatly trimmed hedges and picturesque homes stood as symbols of stability, but behind closed doors, secrets festered. Catherine felt like she was losing herself, disappearing into the background of her own life, and while she smiled at neighbors and participated in bake sales, a deep sense of loneliness followed her wherever she went. John, for his part, felt trapped. The life he had worked so hard to build felt suffocating. The weight of expectations, from his business, from Catherine, from the community, was becoming unbearable. He needed an escape, something to remind him of who he once was before the pressures of success and responsibility took over. It was in this fragile, tension-filled state that John's life would intersect with someone new. Someone who would offer him the comfort and excitement he so desperately craved. Someone who would ultimately set in motion a chain of events that would shatter the peaceful facade of Westbrook forever. The turning point in John's life came unexpectedly, as life-altering moments often do. It began with a school fundraiser in early September, a seemingly mundane event that would eventually set his world on a devastating course. Catherine had volunteered to organize the event, a responsibility she took on with her usual dedication. As always, John attended, but his mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with work, finances, and the endless to-do list that seemed to grow longer by the day. The fundraiser was held in the gymnasium of Westbrook Elementary, where both Sarah and Luke were students. The room buzzed with activity, parents chatting, children laughing, and the clinking of glasses as people moved between tables. It was a typical community gathering, the kind that John had attended countless times before, but tonight felt different. He was restless, eager to leave, but Catherine had insisted he stay for the duration. As John stood near the refreshments table checking his phone yet again, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Sanders, right?" He looked up, startled, and met the eyes of a young woman. She smiled warmly, her bright blue eyes crinkling at the corners. Her presence was disarming, and John found himself smiling back, despite his initial annoyance at being interrupted. "Yes, that's me, and you are—" "Megan Lawson," she introduced herself, extending a hand. "I'm Sarah's new kindergarten teacher. I just moved to Westbrook a few months ago." John shook her hand, noticing how firm her grip was, how confident she seemed, despite her youthful appearance. She was in her early 30s, with a calm yet vibrant energy that contrasted sharply with the exhaustion he felt inside. Her shoulder-length blonde hair was neatly tucked behind her ears, and she wore a simple floral dress that gave her an approachable, almost carefree air. "I've heard great things about you from Sarah," Megan continued. "She's a wonderful little girl, very bright and creative." John smiled politely, though inwardly he felt a pang of guilt. Sarah had mentioned Megan before, but with his hectic schedule, he had never paid much attention. Now, standing here in the middle of the bustling fundraiser, he realized how disconnected he had become from his children's lives. A knot of regret tightened in his chest. "Thank you," John replied, his voice softer now. "Sarah's very lucky to have a teacher like you." They exchanged a few more pleasantries, discussing the event, the school, and the community. Megan shared her experience of moving to Westbrook after her divorce, how she was trying to start fresh with her 5-year-old son, Max. Her honesty caught John off guard. It wasn't often that people shared such personal details so freely, especially not with someone they had just met. "Divorce," John repeated, feeling the weight of the word. "That must have been tough." Megan nodded, her expression briefly clouding. "It was, but I'm getting through it. Westbrook has been a good place to start over. It's peaceful here, and Max loves his new school." John found himself drawn to her openness. It was rare for him to connect with someone on a personal level these days. His conversations, especially with colleagues or clients, were always about work, deals, deadlines, numbers. But Megan wasn't interested in any of that. She wasn't demanding anything from him. She was just there. A refreshing change from the constant pressure he felt in his day-to-day life. As the night wore on, John and Megan talked more, their conversation flowing easily. He told her about his real estate firm, his work, and his family, though he skirted around the deeper issues. Megan listened intently, her gaze never wavering, and for the first time in a long while, John felt heard. When the event ended and people began to trickle out, John found himself reluctant to leave. Megan's company had been a welcome distraction from the stresses that had been weighing him down. As they parted ways in the parking lot, Megan gave him a small, shy smile. "It was nice talking to you, Mr. Sanders," she said. "Maybe we'll run into each other again." John nodded, but something in her smile stayed with him long after he drove home that night. It was the kind of smile that hinted at possibilities, something more than just a chance encounter. Over the next few weeks, John found himself thinking about Megan more often than he would admit. He ran into her at school events and community gatherings, and each time, their conversations grew a little longer, a little more personal. Megan shared stories about her son, Max, and John found himself opening up about the struggles in his own life. She was easy to talk to, non-judgmental, and she seemed to understand the things he didn't say. Their connection deepened quickly, and soon, casual conversations turned into something more. They began exchanging text messages, innocent at first, but slowly, the tone shifted. A joke here, a compliment there, until the messages became more frequent, more intimate. It was as if a barrier had been broken, one that neither of them fully acknowledged. John knew what was happening, and deep down, he knew it was wrong. But in Megan, he found something he hadn't felt in years: freedom. She wasn't part of his stressful, demanding world. With her, there were no expectations, no pressures. She was a break from the monotony, the escape he had been craving. Megan, too, was drawn to John. She admired his success, his confidence, and the way he made her feel important. After her painful divorce, she had doubted herself, questioned her worth. But John's attention reignited something inside her, a desire to be seen, to be valued. Their relationship became a secret refuge for both of them, a place where they could momentarily forget the complications of their real lives. It wasn't long before their interactions went beyond texts and chance meetings. One afternoon, after a school event, Megan suggested they grab coffee. What began as a harmless outing quickly escalated. As they sat in a quiet corner of a local cafe, their conversation shifted from lighthearted banter to something more serious. Megan confided in John about her fears as a single mother, and John, moved by her vulnerability, reached across the table to comfort her. That touch, a simple gesture of empathy, ignited something between them. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, the world around them faded. The next thing they knew, they were kissing, a desperate, forbidden kiss that neither of them could stop. From that moment, everything changed. The affair began in earnest, secret meetings, stolen moments, and passionate embraces that left them both breathless. They met whenever they could, careful to keep their relationship hidden from prying eyes. For John, being with Megan was like stepping into another world, one where the stress and demands of his life didn't exist. For Megan, John represented a chance to feel alive again, but with each stolen moment, the weight of their secret grew heavier. John's guilt gnawed at him, especially when he returned home to Catherine and the kids. Yet, despite the guilt, he couldn't bring himself to stop. He convinced himself that no one would find out, that they could keep their affair hidden. For now, at least. But secrets, as they always do, have a way of coming to light, and when they did, the consequences would be devastating. As the days passed, John and Megan's affair became more than just a fleeting escape. It was an all-consuming force, pulling them both deeper into a web of secrecy and desire. What had begun as a few stolen moments soon turned into a regular, illicit rendezvous. They met in hidden corners of town, careful to stay out of sight. Coffee shops, quiet parks, even the back alleys behind John's office, anywhere they could be alone, away from the prying eyes of Westbrook. For John, these moments with Megan were an antidote to the pressures that weighed him down at home and at work. She was everything his life with Catherine wasn't: carefree, understanding, and unburdened by the constant demands of responsibility. When he was with her, the weight of his world seemed to lift. He could breathe again, if only for a little while. But with each meeting, the distance between John and Catherine grew wider. He began coming home later and later, his once plausible excuses now feeling thin and transparent. Business dinners, client meetings, and late-night work calls, all of it piled up into a web of lies that he barely kept straight anymore. Catherine, always perceptive, could sense that something was off, though she didn't want to believe the worst. One evening, as Catherine was cleaning up after dinner, she noticed that John had left his phone on the kitchen counter. It was unusual for him to leave it behind. He was almost always glued to it, constantly checking emails and messages. For a brief moment, she considered ignoring it, but something gnawed at her. A small voice in the back of her mind urged her to take a look. She hesitated, her heart pounding. She had never been the type to invade John's privacy, but the growing unease inside her wouldn't let her walk away. With trembling hands, she picked up the phone and unlocked it, her mind racing with possibilities. The messages were there, plain as day. A string of texts between John and someone named ML. At first, they seemed innocent, talk of school events, casual banter about the children. But as she scrolled further, the tone changed. Compliments, shared memories of their secret meetings, and then unmistakably intimate words that made Catherine's stomach twist in knots. She dropped the phone, her breath catching in her throat. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. John was having an affair. The room spun around her as she struggled to comprehend the betrayal. How long had this been going on? Was it just physical, or was there something deeper? And most importantly, who was this ML? The initials swirled in her mind, but no name immediately came to her. She knew it had to be someone close, someone who was a part of their world. Trying to steady herself, Catherine put the phone back where she had found it and sat down at the kitchen table. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions, but she knew that confronting John directly wouldn't get her the answers she needed. Not yet. Over the next few days, Catherine began watching John more closely. She noticed how often he checked his phone, the slight smile that would creep across his face whenever he read a message. She saw how distracted he seemed, how often he found excuses to step outside or stay late at the office. Every small detail now felt like another piece of a puzzle that she hadn't realized was there. And then it clicked. Megan Lawson, Sarah's kindergarten teacher. The realization made Catherine's blood run cold. It all made sense now. The long glances at school events, the casual conversations between John and Megan that had seemed so innocent at the time. Megan had always been warm and friendly, and Catherine had welcomed her into their lives, never suspecting for a moment that there could be anything more between her and John. But now everything felt like a lie. Catherine wanted to confront John immediately, but something held her back. She wasn't ready to face the truth, not yet. Instead, she watched, waited, and gathered more evidence. She began paying closer attention to John's schedule, noting the nights he claimed to be working late, the weekends when he said he had meetings with clients. She even checked his phone again, confirming what she already knew. The affair was real, and it wasn't just a passing fling. As the weeks wore on, the tension in their home became unbearable. John, oblivious to Catherine's suspicions, continued his double life, while Catherine struggled to keep up the facade of normalcy. She attended school events, smiled at neighbors, and played the role of the perfect wife, all while her heart was breaking inside. One night, after the children had gone to bed, Catherine sat alone in the living room, replaying the events of the past few months in her mind. How had things gotten this far? How had the man she had loved for so many years betrayed her so completely? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. John walked in, his tie loosened and his hair slightly disheveled. He gave her a tired smile as he tossed his keys onto the table. "Late night?" Catherine asked, her voice cold. "Yeah, sorry about that," John replied, not meeting her eyes. "Had to wrap up a deal with a client." Catherine stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but instead, she swallowed her anger and forced a smile. "That's okay," she said softly. "I'm sure you're just doing what you need to do." John nodded absently and made his way upstairs, completely unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. But Catherine couldn't hold it in much longer. The lies, the deception, the constant betrayals, it was all becoming too much. She knew that a confrontation was inevitable, that the truth would have to come out sooner or later. And when it did, there would be no turning back. For John and Megan, their affair had started as a way to escape the monotony of their lives. But now it was spiraling out of control. The secrecy, the guilt, the constant fear of being caught. It weighed on them both. John found it harder to concentrate at work, and Megan became more anxious with each passing day. They knew they were walking a dangerous line, but neither of them could stop. The affair was no longer just a thrilling secret. It was a ticking time bomb, and they were running out of time. The tension in the Sanders household had reached its breaking point. Catherine could no longer maintain the facade, the polite smiles, and the hollow conversations. The betrayal had gnawed at her for weeks, turning every interaction with John into a bitter reminder of the man he had become. She had tried to suppress her anger, tried to tell herself she would confront him when the time was right, but there was never going to be a perfect moment. One hot Saturday afternoon, the storm finally broke. John had told her he needed to attend another meeting with a client, the same excuse he had used so many times before. Catherine didn't react, didn't question him as he hurried out the door, but inside, she knew exactly where he was going. This time, she was ready. As soon as John's car disappeared down the street, Catherine grabbed her own keys and followed at a distance. Her heart raced as she trailed him through the familiar streets of Westbrook. Each turn, each passing intersection brought her closer to the truth she already knew but wasn't ready to face. John's car eventually pulled into the driveway of a modest house on the outskirts of town, the home of Megan Lawson. Catherine parked a few blocks away, her pulse quickening as she sat in her car, staring at the house. The curtains were drawn, the front door closed, but the betrayal felt as real as if she had walked in on them. For a moment, she considered turning back, driving away and pretending none of this was happening. But that moment passed. With a deep breath, Catherine stepped out of her car and walked briskly toward the house, each step filled with purpose. She didn't knock. Instead, she pushed the door open and walked inside, her mind blank with rage. What she saw confirmed every fear she had tried to suppress. There they were, John and Megan, seated on the couch, laughing softly as they sat close together, their hands intertwined. The sight of them, so comfortable, so intimate, made Catherine's blood boil. For a moment, the room fell into a thick silence. The air, once filled with the quiet murmur of their voices, now hung heavy with unspoken dread. John's head snapped up as he saw Catherine standing in the doorway. His eyes widened, his face draining of color as the realization hit him like a freight train. "Catherine, But before he could finish, Catherine's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Don't!" she spat, her voice trembling with a mix of fury and heartbreak. "Don't you dare say a word!" Megan, still seated beside John, stared in shock, her face pale. She tried to speak, but the words died in her throat. The weight of Catherine's rage was palpable, filling the room with a suffocating intensity. For a moment, Catherine just stood there, her body trembling, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The betrayal, the lies, the countless nights spent wondering where John was. It all crashed over her in a wave of raw emotion. She had held it together for so long, but now she was unraveling. She was, "How long?" Catherine's voice was low, barely more than a whisper, but it was laced with venom. "How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" John opened his mouth to respond, but the truth stuck in his throat. He looked down, unable to meet her gaze, the guilt and shame clear on his face. "That's what I thought," Catherine hissed, taking a step forward. "All those nights you said you were working late. All those lies about business trips and client meetings. It was all for her." Megan, sensing the rising tension, finally found her voice. "Catherine, please, I didn't mean for this to happen. You didn't mean for this to happen?" Catherine's voice rose sharply, cutting Megan off. "You didn't mean to destroy my family? You didn't mean to crawl into bed with my husband and pretend like you're innocent?" Tears welled up in Megan's eyes, but Catherine didn't care. Her anger was like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Years of frustration, isolation, and betrayal had built up inside her, and now it was all pouring out in an unstoppable torrent. John stood up, his hands raised in a feeble attempt to calm her down. "Catherine, listen." But she didn't want to hear it. In a blur of motion, Catherine grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase from the mantel. Without thinking, she swung it at John with all her strength. The vase collided with his shoulder, sending him stumbling backward with a grunt of pain. Megan screamed, jumping to her feet as the scene spiraled out of control. "Catherine, stop!" Megan shouted, her voice filled with panic, but Catherine was beyond reason. Fueled by a mix of fury and heartbreak, Catherine swung the vase again, this time catching John across the side of his head. The sound of the impact was sickening, a dull thud that echoed through the room. Blood splattered across the carpet as John crumpled to the floor, clutching his head in pain. Megan, frozen in shock, fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she dialed emergency services. The operator's voice sounded distant, almost unreal, as Megan breathlessly explained what was happening. "Please, you have to hurry," she cried, her voice cracking. "He's been hurt. There's blood." Meanwhile, Catherine stood over John, panting heavily, her chest rising and falling as the reality of what she had done began to sink in. The vase slipped from her bloodied hands, shattering on the floor with a sharp crack. She stared at John, who lay motionless at her feet, his face pale and bloodied. In the chaos of the moment, everything around her seemed to blur. The walls, the furniture, even Megan's panicked voice, all of it faded into the background. All Catherine could see was the man she had once loved, the man who had betrayed her so completely, lying there in a pool of his own blood. Seconds felt like hours as the sound of sirens grew louder in the distance. The police arrived soon after, their footsteps heavy as they rushed into the house. They found Catherine standing over John's limp body, her hands covered in blood, her face a mask of anguish and disbelief. The officers quickly subdued her, gently pulling her away from the scene and placing her in handcuffs. Catherine didn't resist. She didn't fight or argue. She just stood there, her eyes vacant, as the enormity of her actions finally began to weigh down on her. John was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. The injuries he had sustained were too severe. By the time the paramedics arrived, his pulse had already faded to nothing. Megan stood in the corner, trembling and crying, as the officers questioned her. But no explanation could make sense of the carnage that had unfolded in that quiet suburban home. The days following the tragedy in Westbrook were marked by a heavy, suffocating silence. The tight-knit community, once a beacon of peaceful suburban life, was now gripped by shock and horror. News of John Sanders' death and the violent confrontation that led to it spread like wildfire. It was the kind of story that no one wanted to believe was real, a family torn apart by infidelity, ending in murder. Catherine Sanders, once seen as the perfect wife and mother, was now the subject of whispers and speculation. Her face, pale and emotionless, had been plastered across every local news channel. The image of her standing in handcuffs, blood still staining her hands, was burned into the minds of everyone who saw it. Westbrook was no longer the idyllic suburb it had once been. The town had become synonymous with scandal and tragedy. The media descended on Westbrook like vultures, eager to pick apart every detail of the story. Reporters camped outside the Sanders home, eager for a glimpse of the place where the brutal crime had occurred. Neighbors, once content to live in anonymity, found themselves thrust into the spotlight. Everyone had a theory, a piece of gossip, or a story about the Sanders family. But for Catherine, the world outside no longer mattered. Her life, once filled with school meetings, community events, and family dinners, was now reduced to the sterile, cold walls of a prison cell. She spent her days in silence, replaying the events of that afternoon over and over again in her mind. She had acted out of rage, out of a sense of betrayal so deep that she hadn't been able to control herself. But now, in the aftermath, all she felt was numbness. The trial became a national sensation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighbors, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the drama unfold. Catherine's defense centered on a plea of temporary insanity, arguing that the intense emotional distress of discovering John's affair had pushed her over the edge. Her lawyer painted a picture of a woman who had given everything to her family, only to be betrayed in the most devastating way possible. But the prosecution had a different story to tell. They portrayed Catherine as a woman consumed by jealousy and anger, someone who had planned her actions in a fit of calculated rage. The evidence was damning. Witnesses testified to the growing tension in the Sanders household, the late-night arguments, and Catherine's increasing paranoia. And then there was Megan Lawson, the other woman, who took the stand to describe the affair in painful detail. Megan's testimony was raw, filled with guilt and regret. She spoke of how the affair had started, how it had spiraled out of control, and how she had never intended for it to destroy anyone's life. She wept as she described the moment Catherine burst into her home, the look of pure fury on her face, and the horror of watching John collapse to the floor, blood pouring from his wounds. The courtroom was silent as Megan recounted the final moments of John's life. The tension in the room was palpable, with every eye fixed on her as she wiped away tears, her voice breaking. Catherine, sitting at the defense table, kept her gaze downcast, her hands trembling slightly. She hadn't looked at Megan once since the trial began. As the trial wore on, it became clear that this wasn't just about the murder of John Sanders. It was about the unraveling of a seemingly perfect life, about the fragility of the facade that so many people worked hard to maintain. It was about betrayal, guilt, and the destructive power of secrets. Neighbors took the stand to describe the Sanders family before the tragedy. They painted a picture of a couple who seemed to have it all: success, wealth, children, a beautiful home. But they also spoke of the cracks that had begun to appear in their marriage. Catherine's growing isolation, John's frequent absences, and the tension that seemed to simmer just beneath the surface. The most dramatic moment of the trial came when Catherine herself took the stand. Her lawyer had advised against it, but Catherine insisted. She wanted to explain, to tell her side of the story. As she sat before the jury, her face pale and drawn, she spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I loved him," she began, her eyes fixed on her trembling hands. "I loved John more than anything. We built a life together, a family. I gave up everything for him, my career, my ambitions, because I believed in our future." Her voice cracked and she paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. But then, everything started to fall apart. He wasn't the same man I married. He was distant, cold. I tried to reach him, but it was like he wasn't there anymore. And then I found out about the affair. Catherine's voice faltered as she described the moment she discovered the truth, how the weight of the betrayal had crushed her. She spoke of the rage that consumed her, the heartbreak that blinded her to everything else. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted the events of that afternoon, how she had lost control, how she had acted without thinking. "I didn't mean to kill him," she sobbed, her voice barely audible. I just wanted the pain to stop." The courtroom was silent as Catherine broke down in tears, her body shaking with grief. The jury watched her, their expressions unreadable. The judge called for a brief recess, and Catherine was escorted out of the courtroom, her sobs echoing in the halls. As the trial came to a close, the jury was left with the impossible task of deciding Catherine's fate. Was she a woman driven to madness by betrayal, or had she coldly planned the murder of her husband? The community, once united in their shock and horror, was now divided. Some sympathized with Catherine, believing that anyone in her position might have acted the same way. Others saw her as a monster, someone who had destroyed her family in a fit of jealousy and rage. In the end, the jury reached their verdict. Catherine Sanders was found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The court acknowledged the emotional turmoil she had been under, but the law could not overlook the fact that a life had been taken in a violent and brutal manner. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. The sentence was met with mixed reactions. Some felt it was too lenient, others too harsh. But for Catherine, it didn't matter. The life she had once known was gone, destroyed by her own hands. As she was led away in handcuffs, the final chapter of her life in Westbrook came to a close. Megan Lawson left Westbrook shortly after the trial. The scandal had destroyed her reputation, and though she wasn't to blame for John's death, the weight of guilt followed her wherever she went. She and her son, Max, moved to a new town, hoping to start over once again. The town of Westbrook, once so peaceful, never quite recovered. The house where the Sanders family had lived stood empty for months, a haunting reminder of the violence that had shattered their community. Neighbors who had once exchanged friendly greetings now spoke in hushed tones, wary of the secrets hidden behind closed doors. Catherine's children, Sarah and Luke, were left to grow up without their parents. They were taken in by Catherine's sister, who moved them away from the town that had once been their home. The legacy of their father's death and their mother's crime would follow them for the rest of their lives. Westbrook was no longer the perfect town it had once been. The echoes of that fateful day would haunt its residents for years to come, a constant reminder of how quickly lives could be torn apart by secrets, lies, and betrayal.